This is a review of Disneyland Inside Story, the cover of which looks like it was made by someone for their self-published ebook. Also, Inside Story, The Inside Story, nope, just Inside Story, which as a title may lead you to think that this book is a sort of behind-the-scenes tell-all, or maybe a book on what it's like to work at Disneyland or in Imagineering, but that's not the case, although it does heavily focus on Imagineering in the sense that every book on the Disney parks inevitably has a heavy focus on Imagineering. But what this book is a history and the development of the park and many of the attractions. The book was published by Abrams in 1987 and is written by Randy Bright, who's a former Disney employee. He started working at Disneyland in 1959 and then for 25 years and ended up becoming an Imagineer. It's so well written, so much great information on the first 30 years of the park, and in terms of the writing and information and history it presents of the park, probably one of the best. Of course, I haven't read every book on Disneyland, so if there are any, real Disney parks aficionados, definitely leave a comment if you have any recommendations for books that you think are a better general history or better all-round Disneyland book, whether that's The Nickel Tour or Now, Then and Forever or the recent book by Tarshan. But despite this initial high praise of the writing and content of the book, I do have a number of reservations when it comes to recommending it, because it does have quite a few shortcomings, particularly on the visual side, and it's actually a really sort of important book in the sort of scholarship and publishing on the Disney parks, and really was one of the first books that really tried to give a more thorough history of the park rather than just being a promotional book. And so I'm sure that at the time this very well could have been the best book on Disneyland. However, since none of us are going to be reading this in 1987, and since that time so many more really great books on Disneyland have come out, and I don't think anybody really has the time or money to sort of spend their time bogged down exploring every book that's ever been published on Disneyland. And it can be a real challenge to assess how valuable a book might be to you, especially when it comes to these older Disney books, because you'll read a lot of positive reviews for books like this one, but a lot of that may just be people's sort of fond reminiscence of this book at the time it was released, rather than assessing how it applies to the reader today. My concern is it might not be exactly what you're looking for, and I just want to make sure that you're careful with your time and money, especially with the prices being asked for a lot of these out-of-print Disneyland books. So let's start with the presentation. When I first saw it and first flicked through, I was really impressed. It's a really nice big book with thick, high-quality pages. It looks like there's a lot of text, a lot of images. However, you might be aware, if you've read some of these books on the Disney parks, that the Imagineers use things like forced perspective and other optical illusions to make things in the park look a little more grander than they are. Well, it feels like this book is kind of doing something similar in a way, because if you actually stop and examine a lot of those elements, you start to see its shortcomings. For example, the thing that annoyed me most with this book was that flicking through, it looks like there is a lot of text, especially for these big visual coffee table books. Usually they skimp on the text, and you'll see as we go through, this one has pages and pages of text. However, the formatting of the text is awful, so that it has this really rigid layout where it's only taking up 30% of the page, regardless of if there are any images on the page, and so you just get a lot of white space. So what might appear to be a full page of text really isn't. It's really half a page. And so you see this great big book, but I would say that as much as 30% of this book is actually just white space. And it's actually kind of extra embarrassing, because this book actually features the sentence, quote, "Empty spaces were always anathema to Disney." So that's some potent irony right there. As for the imagery, it's really kind of uneven. There are absolutely some really amazing photos in here, some great behind-the-scenes photos that I have never seen anywhere else, and also plenty of publicity shots, but they're actually really high quality and look really nice. And that's actually one of the aspects of the book that I really do like, which is the great thing about, every decade we get bunches of different Disneyland books, is that you get to see the park in a way that you probably never have before, because a lot of us were probably not born in the 80s and never got to see Disneyland looking like this. However, for as many great photos as there are also a lot of kind of boring ones. But what really results in this being sort of underwhelming as a visual book is that there just simply are not enough images in the book overall. If you evened it out, I would say there are about one image per page, which for a book of this size on such a visually interesting subject is simply not enough. And when you compare it to books of a similar size that have come out since then, it's really underwhelming. Even to compare it to like the Nickel Tour, which came out a couple of years after this one, it is just sort of like packed with visuals. As for the actual content of the text, the way it's written is very sort of warm and almost story-like, so very appropriate for Disney. And so rather than feeling like a dry history, it does much more feel like you're being told a story, the story of the park. Although there are a lot of occasions in which I felt very dubious, because it feels very sort of, a lot of the information and stories feel kind of hammed up or exaggerated, which of course makes for very engaging reading, but it's unclear if these embellishments are coming from Randy Bright himself or the sources he has, I guess, interviewed and spoken to. And so it is sometimes hard to accept some of the information based on how it's presented, because far too often there is sort of absolutely no acknowledgement of where this information is coming from. And as with pretty much any book on the Disney parks, you're going to read a lot of facts and things that you've already heard before, but also I was pleasantly surprised by how much was unique to this book. However, and this is where we get to my major reservation about sort of recommending this book, is that it feels like it's trying to be too many things at once. Is it a big visual coffee table on Disneyland? Is it a thorough history on the park? Is it about the rides? Is it about the Imagineers? It's trying to do all of those things and more, but it's just not able to do any of them sufficiently well. And I would sort of blame that on not having enough space to cover all that topic, but like I said, there's just so much blank space in this book that feels sort of doubly inexcusable. And so why I question this book's value today is that all of those things that I mentioned it's trying to be nowadays have specific books just dedicated to those aspects. We've got books on specific attractions, on the Imagineers, on Imagineering, on the architecture of the Disney parks, on the artwork, on the posters, on the maps. You have all these great resources now where you can specifically hone in on what it is you want to read about and read a really thorough, in-depth book on these subjects that this book simply can't offer. Likewise, if you're someone who's like, I don't really care that much about text, I just want a really beautiful visual book on Disneyland or the Disney parks to just sort of flick through and look through some really great pictures, well, like I said, there are much better books for that available today. Or then the opposite of that is you might be someone who's like, I don't care about all these fancy coffee table picture books. I really want a thorough history. I want, a lot of text and information. Well, you're going to be covered too, because there are just tons of those sort of books. One that I read recently that I really, really enjoyed was The Disneyland Story by Sam Genoway. If you want a more serious and thorough examination of the park's history and the development of the attractions, that's definitely the one I'd recommend. Now, if you're a huge Disney parks enthusiast and you really do want to sort of collect everything, have the complete collection, then of course you probably will enjoy this book, if for no other reason than just sort of to have it as part of your collection. But then if you're someone who's like, I don't want to get like a specific book or something like that. I just want one really great catch-all book that's got great visuals, a great overall general history of Disneyland. Then I mean, maybe this book could be for you, providing you don't want anything after 1987. I mean, I really can see this book being a great introduction to the history, to the first 30 years of the park, for someone who really doesn't know a lot about it and is perhaps not really ready or interested to tackle something that's a bit more thorough, like the Sam Genoway book I mentioned. And like I said, anyone who's a big Disney parks buff, definitely leave a comment if you have any recommendations for a book similar to this, but that you maybe think is a little better. And if you don't think there's one that tops this, then also definitely mention that too. What I really want to try and establish with this review is getting you thinking about whether a book that is just on Disneyland in a very general sense is really something you're going to find particularly satisfying, as opposed to identifying a book that is specifically focused on the areas you're interested in. And so on the whole, I guess my main recommendation is you've really got to take the time to sort of think, what exactly is it you want to read about when it comes to Disneyland? What are the aspects that excite you? What are you looking for in a book? Because the great thing about having, hundreds and hundreds of books published about these parks is that there's undoubtedly going to be one just right for you.